Hello and welcome to the Idaho Reports podcast. I'm Logan Finney. Joining us this week is Senator Jim Woodward from District 1 in North Idaho. Thanks for joining us.
You bet, Logan. Thank you.
So I want to talk to you this week about a number of things, but let's start off first with the Budget Committee. That's kind of the thing everybody's waiting for at this point in session. You're the Vice Chairman on the Senate side of that committee. How is progress in the Budget Committee going?
Well, I think it's a little bit slower than normal. And part of that is as we are voting on some of these budgets now and getting them sent out to the House and Senate, they're not progressing as fast as we like. They're not being produced. I think that there's some a hold up in the Legislative Services Office drafting, not a fault of their own, but just due to the sheer volume. If you've seen the numbers this year, we're way over our averages. Over the last 5 years, we have been going up every year, and we have some proliferation of ideas. And so I think that in the future, we may have to just figure out, we can't limit these elected officials as to how many proposals they want to bring, but we might need to have some kind of discussion about what is a reasonable, rational number. I think there have been some legislators who brought 70 pieces of legislation, 50 pieces. So I think just between two of them, if you look at if the average legislator brought 60 pieces of legislation, we would have 6,000 proposals on the table. That's not going to work.
Sure, yeah. I've seen some of those numbers from the Legislative Services Office. We have just a bigger number of bills that have been introduced this year than the last couple. So you're saying that volume is just that increased workload is making it take longer for budgets to make it out of the committee? That's
part of, well, to get to this House and Senate floor. We also have a budget process that is different than it has been in the past. We went about 50 years with a very standardized process. And a few years ago, I was not in the legislature at the time. I had my little 2-year hiatus. The system was switched over, and to make a distinction between the ongoing budget expenses and then any what we call enhancements, although that word implies they're extra. Sometimes an enhancement might be that you replace a vehicle that's worn out, but you don't do it every year, and so you put that in the budget. Or it might be bulletproof vests for ISP, for the State Patrol. Those, I believe the life on those is 7 years, somewhere in that time frame. And so periodically, you have to buy new bulletproof vests. And so we don't keep that in the budget on a year-to-year basis, but we have to look at it as an enhancement to the budget. And so with those two broken out, there's somewhat of a thought process that we have to do the base budget, but anything in the enhancement budget is above and beyond, and I don't know that that's really the case. And so that's where some of the contention has come, is it's much more difficult to pass those budgets, those enhancement budgets now, because they're ripe for the picking when you have an organization like the Freedom Foundation that scores bills, and anything that's considered extra spending or enhanced spending is a negative. We have a lot of legislators that respond to the IFF scoring. And so the case is, it makes it very tough to do some of the business of the state of Idaho to serve the people of Idaho.
That's part of the pitch of those. They're called the maintenance budgets. Those 10 really big ones. Is it's enough to keep the lights on and service at the same level as it was before. Like you referenced, you had a term off in the middle there where this changeover kind of happened. Now that you're back on the Budget Committee, is it also a case where the ideological makeup of the committee is a little different than it has been in the past? My impression from outside is that there are some pretty considerably more conservative, more fiscally conservative, wanting to cut things out of the budget members on that committee than there had been in the past. Do you think that's a factor?
Well, I'll argue that fiscally conservative is making an investment in our future, and so that in the education budget, some of the other budgets we take on. So I'm not sure that I try to stay away from the word conservative when we have people who are just voting no on every budget, regardless of what it is. But yes, the makeup of the legislature as a whole and the makeup of the committee is certainly different.
Okay. We'll move away from JFAC, the Budget Committee, but another funding and finance issue that you've been working on in your time at the State House is the public school funding formula. It's been described as antiquated, out of date. I mean, it's older than I am. Talk to me about the changes that you've been working on and the conversations you've been having with Superintendent Debbie Critchfield, the other policymakers like Senator Den Hartog, Representative Horman. This is an issue that's been around for a long time. What sort of progress have we made so far this year?
Well, the funding formula, I think it dates back to 1984, which, so yes, relative to your time on the planet here. That funding formula takes into account a notional classroom. And we have a table of divisors in Title 33, the funding formula. This is the money we're sending from the state to all of our K-12 public schools. And we have the ability now to fund with higher resolution, just to pick up take a closer look and send the money to let the money follow the child. That is the idea, that with a weighted student funding formula that we proposed this year in Senate Bill 1096, is that we can see, we already know the student populations, and a student who lives in a rural area, it might take a little bit more to educate. A student who has special education needs takes more to educate.
Certainly.
And all of this is going back to our Idaho Constitution that says that the legislature has a duty to establish and maintain the system of schools, and the word in there is uniform. And so we're trying to provide that education, and if we have the ability in a weighted student funding formula to send the money where it needs to go, then I think that will serve us better. Now, the history of changing the student funding formula goes back almost a decade now. There have been many attempts, and every time we get into changing how the money flows, then you have, quote, winners and losers. Mm-hmm. One school district may pick up, one may lose. So what we did, we believe in that idea of the weighted student funding formula and the money following the child, and so the proposal is to take just a portion of the student funding formula and try it out and start to get some buy-in and some comfort with it. And so of the $3.3 billion in the student, in the K-12 student, or K-12
that public school support budget.
Yeah, thank you for stalling out there.
I've been reading a lot of budgets this week.
Yeah, so of the $3.3 billion, about 13% of that is what we call discretionary. The rest of it is all already tied to sections of code, and then a portion, that 13%, is what school districts can work with to meet their needs and in their circumstances. And so we focused our attention on just that portion of the budget. We came up with a weighted student funding formula. And with those weights, we can always go in and change those weights also. But the idea being that we give more local decision making, because we send that pot of discretionary money out, but we send it based on who the students are in that school district or in that education, local education agency, what we refer to sometimes. So 1096, Senate Bill 1096, we got through the Senate Education Committee, the Senate floor, and it is stalled out in the House. It has not had a hearing. I'd like to see that move forward, but there's some, anytime we get into this, it seems we not only talk about policy, but we talk about politics. And when politics prevails over policy, that's a real challenge. It gets pretty frustrating, and I think that's where we are right now. On both Senate Bill 1096 and Senate Bill 1095, which was another bill that I sponsored, that's going back to put in code what we have done 2 years in a row. So the last 2 years, in the 2023 legislative session, the 2024 legislative session, we put in an extra amount of money on the teacher career ladder, so the money that is allocated to teachers in the school districts. And that was in intent language, though. So it came with the budget bill in the pages that follow the budget bill, but it was not put into Idaho law in Title 33, where the career ladder is.
The Education Code, Title 33.
Exactly. And so we put together a bill to reflect what had been done 2 years in a row, and passed it through the Senate floor, and that was an education bill in regards to the section of code that is education. It went to the House, and the co-chair of JFAC grabbed hold of that, and so it's sitting in House appropriations.
It's uncommon for this, the Finance Committee, the Appropriations Committee, usually you guys operate together as the joint committee, but I've seemed to notice there are several policy-related bills that have ended up in House Appropriations specifically this year. Is this an ongoing symptom of the disagreement between House and Senate leaders that we've seen, or is this something more specific to the school funding formula that's a tough nut to crack?
Well, I think that the Co-Chair Orman wants to make sure that the decision-making reflects her thought process. And so one way to do that is to hold on to bills that somebody else has put through the process. And that's what's going on right now.
Is there any hope of breaking that logjam before whenever the end of session is going to be this year?
Well, it depends on when this goes out on the air, if she hears this or not.
Okay. Well, I'll go ask her about it. We'll see if we have an update. Another bill you have been putting a lot of work on has to do with wildfires, specifically creating a standard of care for electric utilities. So this is an instance where it is, in theory, electric utilities' fault that a fire has sparked because of their transmission lines or whatever. You tell me about the bill.
So the Wildfire Standard of Care Act is something we're trying to avoid a situation that's coming up in other states. The wildfire season in the summer is difficult, and so what we're trying to do is define what an electric utility must do to meet a standard of care. By defining a standard of care, we're saying this is what you have to do as an electric utility, and the way we do that is that each utility will write a plan, and then we'll bring that to the state level at the Public Utility Commission, have a review of that plan, and then if the plan is approved, then if there's an incident where a fire happens, and if, we can take a look at what the liability is based on whether or not the plan was met, and whether or not there's negligence. So in simple terms, we're trying to avoid the scenario where a handful of folks get to sue and bankrupt a utility, and they go off to live in the Bahamas, and the rest of the ratepayers are left footing the bill. Because not only did they get reimbursed for their house or any other damages, economic damages, but it goes above and beyond that to non-economic damages, to emotional type recovery. So we're trying to be able to continue to provide safe, reliable, and affordable power. That's what the electric utilities do. They exist to serve our communities. And we have to distinguish that you don't have a choice with an electric utility. There are defined service territories. And so we're in this situation, it's playing the hand dealt. We have one utility to choose from. If your neighbor chooses to bankrupt that utility, should you then pay for that the rest of the time you're a customer with that utility?
Because as we're setting up this policy, it would have to be something that applies not to just the big behemoths like Idaho Power or Avista. This would also apply to a small city that runs its own electrical grid, or a user electrical co-op, somebody that doesn't have the resources of an Idaho Power.
Well, that's exactly it. And even the big companies we saw in California, PG&E went down. They were bankrupt after the 2019 Paradise Fire. Now, in that case, I believe they were determined negligent because of lack of maintenance on their lines. But whether it's our largest power provider in the state or our smallest, the same scenario exists that the ratepayers have to pay. And so we're trying to define ahead of time what the responsibility is to the community. We've taken on that risk. We have put power lines up, and we know that that's an energy source. If you have perfectly maintained power lines and the utility has not done anything negligent, but a storm comes through, do we put that fault on the utility, or do we have to take that all on as ourselves through our insurance?
At a community level.
Exactly that, yeah.
So if this bill does pass into law, it would be, the new way of the world would be the utilities would submit a wildfire mitigation plan, and then if a fire did occur, as long as they can demonstrate they reasonably were following that mitigation plan, they're protected from liability. Is that a fair way of putting it?
I think everything's accurate except for protected from liability, because the bill still allows for recovery of economic damages, and even in certain cases it goes into existing code, and which allows for economic and non-economic in some cases, and punitive in other cases. So we're utilizing existing code, not making a new exemption from liability, but just defining ahead of time what the expectations are.
As we're talking on Tuesday afternoon, this version of the bill has made it through the Senate. It took a couple tries. What are its prospects in the House now?
Well, first I'll speak to the couple tries, because
Sure.
yes, it's going over to the House, and it'll be heard in House State Affairs tomorrow morning. What what was the impetus for this bill in the first place? Well, it goes back to 2023 with the governor's wildfire summit, and we had a recommendation out of the summit plus a lot of working groups afterward, and a report from that said we need to address, this was concern number 2 in wildfire here in the state of Idaho. And so that was our task as the utilities across the state to figure out how to address that. And so here we are. We spent a year drafting, working with with a large number of attorneys, and had stakeholders involved. That second attempt at the Senate to get it across the Senate floor was because communications had broken down a little bit, and so we got to a certain point, stalled, and then got everybody back in the room, addressed the concerns of about 95% of the concerns.
No such thing as a perfect bill.
That's right. And then we're able to bring that back across the floor. We had a good solid vote. We had 24 votes out of 35, so almost a 70% approval to bring it across the Senate, and then we have it sent on.
And then House State Affairs, you said?
House, yes, it will be heard in House State Affairs, and then hopefully on up to the House floor. Okay.
Well, by the time listeners are listening to this, that'll we'll have some coverage of what happened to that bill in House State Affairs. Another issue that you've worked on, this is a bill that is not expected to move forward. It's just been introduced as a discussion piece. You worked with Representative Mark Sauter, also from District 1. You guys introduced a health exemption for the state's abortion ban. Talk to me about why you brought that policy forward, and my understanding is it's some pretty specific North Idaho issues that you're looking to address.
You bet. I want to first give credit to Representative Sauter for all the work he's put into this. We printed this bill in the Senate, so my name shows up first, but he has spent a lot of time on this and talking with many people to try and come to a point that maybe we could move something forward. We did acknowledge that at this late in the session, we were trying to start the conversation again. And so that bill specifically addresses fetal anomalies and then life of mother versus health of mother. And so the goal is to acknowledge that there are complications in pregnancy. In the Idaho code that we have right now, I'm not sure that we're quite in the right spot. And so that is evidenced in Legislative District 1, which is Bonner and Boundary County. So when we start from the Canadian border and come down as far as Coeur d'Alene, that's about 100 miles. There's not an OBGYN to be found. And so for a family, a woman with her family, to go through a pregnancy right now, and you live north of Bonner's Ferry, it's easily an hour-and-a-half drive for a routine wellness check. And that's either driving to Coeur d'Alene, over to Montana, or over to Washington.
Not to mention some sort of emergency.
That's exactly it. And so if we're just doing a routine wellness check, and it takes an hour-and-a-half at the same time to get there in an emergency, then we're a very good chance that we're going to be delivering alongside the road. In fact, the emergency services have acknowledged that and have conducted more training.
Oh, wow.
Because they realize that they may be called to deliver a baby alongside the road as someone is headed to a hospital.
So this would make some the bill's not moving forward is my understanding, but if it did, it would make some tweaks that your intention is to make doctors more comfortable staying in the state. Is that the intention here?
That is a big part of it, and that's where I was headed and got off on a different piece. But we don't have those OBGYNs here because they're not comfortable working here in Idaho. You talk about someone who spent 12 years to become a medical professional. They have good judgment, and they're making a judgment about themselves, their ability to practice. They have families, and when we put the threat of a felony in front of someone, when they're making a medical decision, that's hard. And so I think that instead they're making a decision up front that Idaho is not the right place. We have the lowest number of doctors per capita in the nation. And so we're helping to drive that number down some more. We just need to acknowledge the situation that whether we think that the existing code is okay or not, and we think it would hold up in a court challenge, the reality on the street and in the hospitals and in the doctor's offices is that they're uncomfortable with it. We trust them with our lives, but we don't trust them to make this decision about a complication during pregnancy.
In that introductory hearing, I was very struck by, we had Senator Shippey, who's a pretty hardline anti-abortion person. He has introduced similarly an abortion bill that's not going to move, but that would get rid of the rape and incest exemptions under the existing code. And he said, even though he disagrees with the fundamental premises of how the abortion law is set up right now, he saw your bill as in line with the existing framework. What was your reaction hearing that from him?
I was surprised and happy. If we can have that conversation, that's wonderful.
Another North Idaho specific issue, this is one that I'm really excited about, having grown up on the shores of Lake Pend Oreille. Lake Pend Oreille, that northern lake in Bonner County, is controlled by Albany Falls Dam, which is a structure under the control of the Army Corps of Engineers. Talk to me about the lake, talk to me about the dam. What's the issue with the dam, and how are the feds not doing so well at getting it taken care of?
Well, we have two pieces going on there, two issues going on. One is the shorter term repair of the Albany Falls Dam floodgates. About a year and a half or 2 years ago now, there were defects discovered in the floodgates, and there are 10 of those floodgates plus one spare. Right now, the one is off being repaired, and so they've changed essentially put the dam in an emergency status because they've changed their operational guidelines, but they're not treating it like an emergency. The dam, the powerhouse, the substation, all of those were built in about a 4-year period, I think, in the early 1950s, and they're talking about replacing those gate structures. At one point, it was a discussion of 20 years.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, and now we've got, I think it's down to maybe it'll be 6-7 years, like something like that, to replace those. But it's kind of like saying I can build a car in a few weeks, but it's going to take me a year to change the tires when the tires come due when they're worn out. And so we've been trying to put the pressure on, look, we need to fix this faster. I think that we're moving in that direction. I'm not sure that they're totally convinced yet how fast they can move, but we'll continue to push. So that's the more emergent issue. But the longer term issue that we've dealt with is the agreement on lake water levels. That goes back to when the dam was put in place. There were hearings in the United States Senate. There's a document that describes what the agreements were. The dam is operated for multiple purposes, and that's navigation, fisheries, flood control, recreation, and power production. And each one of those has an ideal operating curve. If you look at the level over the course of the year, we call that an operating curve.
And that's the level of how much water is in the lake at a given time?
Yes, and so the lake, it fluctuates about 11 feet based on what the Army Corps is doing with it. But each one of those curves is different, and so then you have to come up with a compromise between those 5 curves and say, here's how we're going to operate. And right now, where the original intention was that the lake would be at that full high pool roughly half the year, we're at full pool about 2.5 months of the year.
Only 2.5?
2.5.
Oh.
Yeah, it's about 2.5 months of the year. And so that creates access issues year round, and part of that is access issues for emergency services. So right now, if you're familiar with Sandpoint, you come in, you get your big long bridge moment for the first time you come to Sandpoint, and running close to the highway bridge is a train bridge. And so one of the scenarios that you have to deal with is if a train ever derailed off that and fell into the lake, you have to respond to that. Now, the state has provided some emergency equipment, oil booms and other emergency response equipment in the northern area. And to deploy that in the summertime at full pool is just simply a few minutes away at City Beach. And you can drag those oil booms out and start to deal with that issue. In the wintertime, you'd have to drive halfway around the perimeter of the lake, go clear to Hope, Idaho, and then drag all that equipment back across the lake. It might take a day to respond. So that's an issue, that we don't have the ability to respond to potential emergencies. Of course, the economic impact to Sandpoint, which is partially a tourism economy.
Certainly.
And the people who own waterfront homes are paying taxes on waterfront homes, but a good portion of the year, those are mudflat homes. It's on the north end of the lake in particular, the water, with that much of a vertical drop in water, the water can be out 200 or 300 or 400 feet from their homes.
And that's some pretty thick clay on a lot of that lake.
That's right. And so there are a lot of aspects to it, and we think that the lake levels, that the system can be operated differently. This is all part of the system from the reservoir in Montana through Whitefish Lake into Pend Oreille, with Clarkport coming into Pend Oreille, and then on down to Portland. But we think that system can be operated differently, and we're in progress on an economic study, and then we'll also look at a hydrologic study to say provide some options of how that might be run.
And I do want to note that the water rights for the northern lakes, Priest Lake, Lake Pend Oreille, Lake Coeur d'Alene, those are held nominally by the governor for recreation purposes and for the benefit of the health of the state. So is it a matter here of just putting more pressure on the Army Corps to be operating a dam in the way that the locals prefer? Is it that they're prioritizing other issues like habitat and power generation over recreation? What's the disconnect there?
Well, I think it is just maybe just a heavy lean toward the power end, but I think that the same amount of water goes through all year round, and so in the end, with the growing need for power, the timing of that power is not as important as it used to be. So that dam could be operated with the water coming through at different times of the year and still make full use of that. I think that over time an institution just gravitates for one direction, and so we have to kind of break through that. The lake was operated, maybe 10 or 15 years back at a higher level in the wintertime, about 4 feet higher than what it is now. So it was maintained at a mid-pool, and that helps with all with the access and utilization of the lake. So we could go back to that. That was a period of time that was operated at that mid-pool based on basically an experiment for the fisheries, and I'm not sure why we didn't just stick with it.
Okay, and you're planning on running some legislation related to this?
Well, we have had a hearing in the Senate Resources Committee where we had all the folks involved that I kind of referred to, the hydrologists, the economic impact study, the Lakes Commission, which is in regards to Priest and Pend Oreille, and we'll have a resolution. That'll be heard in Senate State. It'll be printed tomorrow in Senate State Affairs, and then we'll be back to the Resources Committee with a resolution to provide some information at the federal level to the folks back there what our thoughts are.
Okay, and just one more clarifying detail. There was a different resolution having to do with a management area in East Idaho that called for the state to take over management of that area because they're having some different water-related issues. Would this be like that or not like that? Does this resolution call for the state to take over Albany Falls Dam from the feds, or we're not touching
Not
that?
necessarily, although that is part of the conversation, because there is some documentation from back in the 50s that the thought process being that when the dam had paid for itself with the generation of electricity, then control could revert to the state. I'm not sure we're asking that yet, but we certainly want to have more involvement in what the lake level is and how it's operated over the course of the year.
All right. Well, we will keep an eye on all of these issues. Senator Jim Woodward, thank you for being so generous with your time this week.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Logan.
Thanks for listening to the Idaho Reports podcast. Tune in to the Friday show at 8 p.m. on Idaho Public Television, and visit idahoreports.org to stream episodes and keep up to date with the events of the 2025 legislative session.
Union Pacific Railroad, serving Idaho for more than 160 years. A proud partner of Idaho Public Television. Presentation of Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. by the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.